as we acknowledge God's presence, let us pray. Father, Mother God, we give thanks. We give thanks for all that is and all that isn't. We give thanks for all that was and all that wasn't. We give thanks for all that will be and all that won't be. Our gratitude is independent of our circumstances because we give thanks. And so it is that together we say, Amen. Yes, we can say no. Over the course of the last several months, in fact, I've been talking about the one great commandment, that is, love God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. And it turns out that last week, two people mentioned to me the challenge that they saw in that process because they don't want to be a doormat. So we're going to be talking about boundaries today. But as an homage to Mother's Day, I'd like to have a special shout out for those people who were not able to have children but decided to adopt. That can be a very scary thing. A couple went into the adoption agency and they said, we'd like to adopt a child. And the officer in the agency handed them an application, which they sat down and filled out and came back and sat down with the officer, the adoption officer. And looking over the application, he says, oh, I see that the two of you are employed in the circus. Well, yes, we are. Well, that presents a problem because we're really concerned about the children that we place having a stable home, and you're going to be traveling all over the country, left coast and right coast and center, and so we're concerned about that. They said, don't worry about that because we've got a 50-foot mobile home. Here, let me show you pictures, and laid out the pictures of this beautiful mobile home, and it even had a nursery in this mobile home. And the officer said, well, that's pretty impressive. But traveling around the country, we're concerned that you're going to have adequate medical care because children do take a lot of medical attention. Oh, don't worry about that because we've already hired a registered nurse who is specifically focused on pediatric care. So that's taken care of. Officer said, well, that's fairly impressive. But education, we're concerned about a consistent education. And they said, no worries. Here in the circus, we have a teacher that is specifically childhood education qualified, and she's actually quite good. And the officer says, well, you've covered all the bases. What age child are you interested in adopting? And the would-be mother says, well, it doesn't really matter as long as they fit into the canon. Okay, so I'll have to tell you, when I found that joke, it took me several tellings of the joke to not be cracking up prior to the punchline. So, all right. Well, this question of boundaries. One of the things that I hear from mothers is that they have a hard time setting the boundaries. And one could say that I'm not one to deliver this talk. In that my daughter and her family have been living downstairs for 10 years. But actually, I think I've expressed to you, I know I've expressed to you, I feel very blessed that the grandkids are so close by. It's truly fun. My wife doesn't always have that opinion, however. She's fairly assertive in establishing her boundaries. Well, so I'd like to discuss boundaries as it relates to this practice of giving unconditional love. It can be a challenge oftentimes. There's a group in Wisconsin that is specifically focused on mental health care issues. This group, called the Wisconsin Initiative for the Stigma Elimination, WISE, is all about helping healthcare workers and mental health patients in moving forward in progressing in their healing. And the WISE group has come up with a number of suggestions that I'm going to share with you this morning. They talk about a particular thing called compassion resilience. In fact, I think that Brene Brown, a noted author, has used that term, maybe even created that term, but compassion resilience is about this practice of when mental health care workers are involved, whether they be psychotherapists or psychologists or psychiatrists, that they can get involved in their clients' challenges. And if they are compassionate in their approach, they can become overly involved to the point where they are stricken with depression, irritability. In fact, irritability can range all the way from disappointment all the way up to rage and everything in between. All of that whole anger spectrum is really related to fear. And so it is very possible for us, as we are practicing this unconditional love, to become unresilient in our compassion by just being overwhelmed with the challenges that the people that we are engaged with present to us. So compassion resilience is also related to the other end of the spectrum, compassion fatigue. And you may be familiar with compassion fatigue. You have a friend that you're giving unconditional love to, and they come to you because you are a source of support for them. But you have your own life, you have your own activities, you have your own priorities, your own values, and oftentimes those are set in juxtaposition to the needs of the person that you are specifically trying to assist. So this compassion fatigue is really what the question was about. Last week, one person specifically asked about that. Conversation with another person led me to that same, this is in the same ballpark. This is the same issue. Compassion fatigue arises when we have expressed ourselves we've given love to the moment. We've given love to a particular individual who has come to us with need, and we get tired, right? We get exhausted of dealing with those issues. So setting boundaries is really a means of preventing this compassion fatigue. It's a means of stimulating the resilience of compassion. And setting boundaries can, in fact, build trust between individuals. So if a person is encountering another, stepping over what would otherwise be a defined boundary, the knowing that the boundary is there allows the two people to start to have trust in each other, that they're not going to impinge or violate those boundaries. So, what is a boundary? Let's start with that definition. What's a boundary? I'm sorry?
A limit.
A limit. A definition of a limit. A limit of what? Behavior. Exactly. A boundary, as we're talking about it, is a limit on behavior. And defining that limit of behavior is an important part of this healthy assistance between two individuals. So, behavior. Behavior is kind of interesting. We sometimes confuse behavior with consciousness. Now, offering unconditional love, one could say that that's a behavior. But in my mind, offering unconditional love is the outgrowth of a consciousness of unconditional love. Okay? So in that respect, offering unconditional love is a behavior, but unconditional love in and of itself is a consciousness. And so our consciousness here, the events of the world, our experience, what happens in our day-to-day is here, and what is in between are the behaviors. Do you see that? So we've got the consciousness here, and that consciousness is interacting with the events of the world through our behaviors. All right? So I make that point because it's important for us to recognize what is consciousness and what this idea of consciousness is about, and and how that interfaces with the world, and it interfaces through our behaviors. So what we're talking about here is we're talking about a limit of behaviors, and we're talking about a definition in our own mind of what is acceptable behavior. We're defining our boundaries by identifying our acceptable behaviors. So when we define our boundaries, when we recognize, what our boundaries are, and then express those boundaries, what we're doing is we're defining appropriate behavior. We're defining appropriate behavior not only to ourselves, but also to the other person, right? And that is establishing, if you will, a social contract with that other person. So being able to have your boundaries identified and being able to express those boundaries in a compassionate way will establish a contract between you and the other person that allows them to know where they can, what behavior is acceptable and what behavior is over the line, or what behavior penetrates or violates that boundary. So as we are practicing unconditional love, we also need to have, for our own resilience, our own compassionate resilience, we need to be able to define what those boundaries are. So what happens when we don't define those boundaries? What happens when we are giving, and the other person is taking to the point where they're just right up in your face? What happens when that occurs? Anger. Frustration.
And into a relationship, and into
A breakdown of the relationship. Maybe not an ending of it, but relationships are really hard to end. Even in the passage of a friend, we still have a relationship with that, right? Even when we divorce our supposed life partner, we still have a relationship with that person. Maybe it's a relationship that is grounded in the past, but nonetheless, it's still a relationship that exists. So this relationship is challenged. It can deteriorate. And that frustration, that anger, that irritability not only affects the behavior with them, but it also affects us. Right? It affects our own self-esteem, our own commitment to offering unconditional love. It affects us as well. And whether or not we express that irritability, if we suppress that if we don't express that to the other person, that can literally lead to depression. And depression is that unexpressed anger, that unexpressed frustration. So it is vitally important that we take care of ourselves by establishing those boundaries and communicating those boundaries. And in fact, that is part of our practice. There is in Matthew 5, verses 31 to 37, 33 to 37, again, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, or for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. I often use this as in the discussion on judgment. But this is also applicable as we talk about boundaries. You can say, yes, this is acceptable, or no, that is not acceptable. And so this idea of being able to say either yes or no at your discretion is an important part of this self-care. So when we are establishing boundaries with unconditional love, in the practice of unconditional love, identifying what is behavior versus what is consciousness, being able to set those boundaries with unconditional love. I mean, setting the boundaries does not mean that you are not expressing unconditional love. It can, in fact, mean that you are expressing unconditional love, because you're defining for the other person what is acceptable. You're defining your social contract with that other person. And in so doing, as I said earlier, you are building trust with that other person, and you are allowing them to see what is appropriate, not only with you, but also with other people. So you're establishing a boundary between you and another person. It's not about establishing a wall, but rather establishing a limit on acceptable behavior. So as you establish the boundary, it's important for you to first identify what your values are. I mean, this is good practice anyway, to articulate your values, because as you go through life, the circumstances, the situations will have a unique flavor. And if you are not clear about what your values are, you may in fact engage in your own behavior that is contrary to what your values are. And when that happens, you lose self-esteem. When that happens, you grow frustrated with yourself. When that happens, you weaken the foundation upon which you're building your life. So articulating what your values are is an important thing to A, do, and B, keep in mind. So, how do you want to be treated? Do you want to be called at 4 a.m. to have your friend discuss with you what the recipe is for blueberry muffins? Unless that is your daytime, probably not. I had someone call me the other night. It was about 10 o'clock at night. And whenever I have my cell phone on, I answer it. I even answer these spoofing calls because I never know when someone is in need of prayer or when someone is curious about this ministry. So I answer the phone whenever it's on. And the other night, I got a call from someone that I knew. She had been part of this community 8 or 10 years ago. And so I answered the call, and it was at 10:30 at night. She said, "How are you?" I said, "I'm fine. How are you?" She said, "Well, I'm good. I wanted to know if you had the phone number for thus and so." And I said, "Now, wait a minute. You're calling me at 10:30 at night to ask me for a phone number for someone? Really?" She said, "Yeah." Well, I gave her the phone number. And then she went on to say, how's the family and so on. I said, it's 10:30 at night here. I'd be happy to talk with you tomorrow about life and times, but right now, I don't think is the right time. So in my response, it wasn't as if I didn't want to talk to her about life and times. I just didn't want to talk to her about life and times at 10:30 at night. It's important for us to establish how we want to be treated. I don't want to be directory assistants for someone who is interested in contacting someone else within the community when I'm about ready to go to sleep. So identifying how you wish to be treated is an important part of this. And so naming your limits, setting limits on what is acceptable for you. Making self-care a priority. Oftentimes, as we are practicing unconditional love, being willing to be there for the other person in all circumstances, we can lose sight of the fact that if we're not healthy, if we're not resilient, if our compassion resilience is at an ebb, then we can't be there fully for the other person, right? So making note of the importance of self-care is an important part of this. How do you want to be treated? Naming your values. And then give yourself permission to say no. It is vital that you understand that practicing unconditional love can also include saying no. When you are in this process of establishing boundaries, it's important for you to tune into your feelings. How am I feeling right now? How am I feeling with respect to this request, whatever the request is? Am I feeling irritated? Am I feeling honored? Am I feeling like I need to change the baby's diapers, or I need to make sure that my meal isn't burning, or what other things are going on in my life right now, and how am I feeling about this particular, I'll call it an incursion because the request is coming perhaps out of the blue. So tuning into your feelings. We often, women are particularly so, if I could be gender biased here for just a moment. There tends to be a behavior that I will be liked if I am nice. I will be liked if I am responsive. I'll be liked if I am helpful. I'll be liked if. It's not to say that that only occurs with women, but the issue is that when we establish boundaries, it's important for us to know how we are, why we're responding as we are. So, if we are responding because of fear that we're not going to be well liked if we don't respond in the way that the person is asking us to, or if we are wanting to accommodate that is unhealthy, if it's violating our own self-esteem, it's important for us to pay attention to those feelings. What is the challenge in articulating your boundaries is to be compassionate as you are doing that, as you're expressing that, to be compassionate with the other person. One of the ways that, you could say, don't bother me now, right? I'm not interested in your problem now. That would not necessarily be a compassionate response. It might be, but that would be on the extreme case where that would be compassionate. But a response more like, I see that you're having a need right now, and I really want to be able to accommodate what your needs are, but frankly, right now is not the time. I'm distracted. I'm concerned about something else, or I'm helping someone else, or whatever. But being compassionate in your expression of where is the boundary? The boundary is here because I want to be available to you when I can. But right now, I need to have some space. Right now, I need to focus on this other project. I need to focus on this other situation. So I can't be there for you right now. Being compassionate in your expression of boundaries is important. But being direct is also as important. If you are practicing self-awareness, if you are tuning into your feelings, if you are looking at the situation and seeing how you are responding to that situation, being self-aware is an important practice in setting these boundaries. And then consider your past and your present behavior with setting boundaries. Have I been negligent of my own self-care in the past? Well, pay attention to that. Let yourself be reminded that that is an important part. Oftentimes, when we set boundaries, we feel like we're out here on an island by ourselves, and there's no one who is in tune with what my needs are. Seek support. Talk with a friend. Describe what boundaries you are wanting to establish and get the friend's feedback. And look for honest feedback. I mean, there are times when a friend might say, oh, yeah, you're fine. But seek honest feedback. Is this an appropriate boundary? Is this an appropriate behavior that the other person is seeking support on? Be assertive and start small. Baby steps. Establish boundaries in such a way that you can say that this, maybe I don't, let me back up. On Sunday morning, there is a ritual in our house where I get up. I have my morning activities that will also include, after a meditation, I'll fix coffee, and then I'll fix breakfast. And I'll fix breakfast for all the grandkids. I don't fix breakfast for the whole clan, but I fix breakfast for the grandkids. And typically it's bacon and eggs. And over the course of time, I've come to realize that sometimes the grandkids don't want to have breakfast that early in the morning, or they want to wait for mom to make the, whatever special breakfast she's going to make. So I say, okay, so who wants breakfast this morning? And sometimes I get, I do. Sometimes I get, no thanks, I do. That third I do is always Mackenzie. Mackenzie is starving all the time. So she usually eats breakfast with me. But when the other kids say, no, not right now, and I fix bacon, and that bacon, I'd be a vegetarian if it weren't for bacon. They come up and they say, could I have a piece of bacon? Well, let's see. I asked about 10 minutes ago if you wanted breakfast. You said no. So no, that bacon is actually for Linda and for Mackenzie and I. So establishing that boundary, that's a small boundary. Start small, expand, make your boundaries, allow your boundaries to grow, and practice the articulation of these boundaries. And then, when it's all said and done, you've got your boundaries nicely arranged around you. Feel free to let them be violated. Because situations are dynamic. Situations are unique. And sometimes someone just needs to have support now. Even if it's 10:30 at night and they're looking for a phone number for another congregant. So allow yourself to understand, give yourself permission to set boundaries so that you do not encounter compassion fatigue. Allow yourself to grow your boundaries in such a way that they are identifiable, they are stable, and they can be penetrated.
So you make more bacon
I
now?
keep my small boundaries. Those are pretty intact. So unconditional love, as a practice, unconditional love does not mean that you're a doormat. It does not mean that someone can impose upon you their particular needs at any time. Unconditional love is a consciousness of moving through the world, not necessarily defining your behavior. Unconditional love is, in my mind, unconditional love is the ultimate spiritual practice. But it takes practice, practice, practice. We'll have our meditation. As we come into our meditation, let us come in with I cast all my cares. Breathing into this moment. Breathing in and breathing out. Paying attention to our breath. Allowing ourselves to slip into the rhythm of our breathing. As we breathe in, giving thanks for the oxygen that we are offered. Breathing out, acknowledging that what we have given can be used by our plant friends, and they're breathing in. Acknowledging this relationship that we have just in our respiration. It can illustrate the connection that we have with each and every person on this planet. For those that we know and those that we don't know. Those with whom we share our values and those whose values are very different from ours. But acknowledging that this web of relationships, in this web of relationships, we are connected to each and every person on this planet. Regardless of their values, regardless of their opinions, regardless of their approach to life and their response to the situations in their lives. Let us be compassionate. Let us cut them some slack. Let us acknowledge that their challenges, while they may be unique, are no more important or less important than our own. Visualizing this web of relationships, our connections with each and every person on the planet. In this awareness, we are empowered. We're empowered to be the avenue through which unconditional love moves into this moment. We're empowered to be the very full vehicle of the love of God here in this moment. And we also acknowledge that being healthy requires that we set limits. Because in being healthy, and only in being healthy, in our expression of unconditional love, can we sustain our practice. Breathing in and breathing out to this realization. We come back into this time and space, sharing the words of Alleluia. And we'll take an offering for unity now. As we take our offerings in our hands, let us bless them with this offering statement. Together, please. Divine love through me blesses and multiplies all that I have, all that I give, and all that I receive. I give in love because I trust in God. And once again, Trinity Damascus, irreverence.